goodness. Okay.
God bless.
All right. I guess we'll get started. Looks like we have a good number of folks here. Welcome to the Monday Colloquium. We are. Thank you, Bernie. Are delighted to have Professor Aaron Deslatte here with us today from the O'Neill School. And his work is very wide ranging, but I think has a sort of a large amount of contribution to the area of sort of local climate action planning and institutional analysis. For doing so, institutional adaptability, sort of coupled human infrastructural systems, all sorts of of concepts that are really central to the workshop. So we are just, we're so grateful that you could be here today. Really looking forward to this presentation. Aaron is an affiliate of the workshop, as well as works with the Environmental Resilience Institute here at OU. And let's see, directs the Metropolitan Governance and Management Transitions Laboratory here. Yeah. And then has a wide range of collaborations across the countries, one of which it looks like we're going to hear about today. In his presentation, Climate Adaptive Collective Action and Ambiguity, Tracing Institutional Processes in Urban Water Management, really interesting comparison between Indiana and Arizona. So really looking forward to this. Y'all know the rules at this point, right? 15 minutes of a presentation and we'll maybe just clarification questions during that time period. And then afterwards we'll discuss. I will be happy to handle the virtual and in-person queue. Without further ado, thanks very much for being here.
Thank you. Last time I presented this work in Denver in January, I blew it and didn't get the results until the last 2 minutes. So I'm going to try to get to the results here as quickly as possible. So this is part of a 5-year NSF grant through what used to be the CNH2 and is now the DICES program. We're coming up on the beginning of our 5th year or so. So it's time to figure out what, if anything, we've accomplished and get ready to write the next grant. So a couple of my co-authors on this particular paper are here, Elizabeth Cobley, who is in the Zoom. She's at the University of Nevada, Reno. And then Adam Weekman, who is a graduate student of Marty Andrews, who some of you might know out at ASU. And he is on this project, Marty and Adam both. So they are with us in Zoom presence, right? So if they need to call upon them, hopefully they're paying attention. Let me go ahead and minimize this screen. Sorry. So the basic research question we're sort of looking at is what about institutions in this context of urban water management makes them climate adaptive, which there's large kind of literature that's growing on adaptive capacity and kind of adaptive governance and different sorts of environmental spaces. Sometimes this literature treats institutions explicitly as something that it attempts to measure and understand. Sometimes it's treated more as kind of an exogenous factor. And so there's a lot of underdeveloped or a lot of sort of, maybe room to try to contribute to this literature by focusing explicitly on institutional designs and trying to determine when they may be adaptive to uncertainty or novel social dilemmas like climate, and when they might be maladaptive. So we focus specifically on kind of one purpose of institutions, which is to try to routinize patterns of human interaction and endeavor. In other words, they provide kind of guide rails for humans to try to interact and solve problems. Typically, we think of kind of rigid institutional designs that are maybe created for yesterday's problems and not tomorrow's problems as being sort of overly cumbersome or regulatory and not up to the task. We don't want to make that assumption, and so we're looking at how do we in an institutionally designed system or institutional infrastructure, can we match flexibility with rigidity? So when is it good to have more rigid or formal institutional sort of rules? When do you need to have flexibility to try to innovate and be entrepreneurial? So that's essentially what we're trying to contribute in this space. So we use the Coupled Infrastructure Systems Framework, or CIS framework, for most of our work. We do that because we're looking at heavily engineered SESs, right? So a lot of hard natural or hard physical infrastructure. In particular, though, we focus for this paper and on our portion of the project on that sort of interaction or link 3, which in the CIS framework, all these links are basically flows or feedbacks, right? So it's information, it's resource flows, it's material flows, and this is just sort of how we organize our thoughts and organize our concepts and variables and models. So we focus again on this link between essentially the governance, right? The public infrastructure providers and the actual public infrastructure itself, which can be both hard in terms of physical infrastructure, dams, reservoirs, pipes, and the soft infrastructure, which is the institutions, right? The rules, the policies that determine how the actors in this space interact with each other and how they make decisions. There are, can I get rid of this little guy as well? I'm sorry. Sorry, everybody. There's 2 separate sort of research or parallel research projects going on right now related to this institutional analysis. The one that I'm presenting you with today are sort of empirical institutional analysis, where we look at specific structural features of a system and try to assess the effects of these features on how they function. So essentially how these processes play out as these urban water systems attempt to adapt or deal with changing environmental conditions. Separately, though, we're trying to use the empirical analysis to inform the development of these dynamic systems models. Because ultimately, adaptation, we're not going to know if a system's truly adaptive for another 10, 20, 30, 40 years, right? Until we see how they've ultimately dealt with climate. We can't wait that long to reach some conclusions about the design. So that's where sort of dynamical systems models and agent-based modeling obviously comes into play to help out. Okay, I messed myself up already. So in the paper, we kind of lay out these 3 propositions. These don't maybe on the surface seem like incredible novel propositions, but we try to argue that for each of these propositions, we believe there's a threshold and there are trade-offs ultimately that are involved. And so that's kind of what we're trying to think through and then ultimately empirically explore and model is when we get too much of these particular sort of design features. So the first is information and search. Climate adaptive institutions support diverse information flows or feedback. The idea there being generally, we'd like to have more types of information brought into decision-making venues, but at some point information overload occurs. Oftentimes we'll have overtraining essentially of our predictions, of our models, of our thinking and policies to the data at hand, in which case we end up creating errors when we try to make predictions out of population or out of data. And so we get into this sort of bias variance trade-off there. But generally, we like to think that more information is better than less information. And notice we don't say disinformation here or misinformation. We're assuming that the information that we're bringing into a system is actually usable and relevant for making investment decisions. The second proposition is based on how we update our normative valuations. And this is our proposition here is that climate adaptive institutions enable more diverse stakeholders to participate in repeated interactions. Again, the idea being if we have folks with different experiences, different norms, valuing different things qualitatively, that they're going to be able to triangulate and create more novel solutions, or they're more likely to do that. Of course, we know larger and larger groups, though, also end up creating more difficulty in reaching agreement. So again, there's got to be a threshold here, and there's probably trade-offs. The more of these, the more conflicting or sort of differing norms or evaluative criteria that we would bring into a situation. And then lastly, heuristics for selecting strategies. Climate adaptive institutions allow a variety of heuristics for improving learning over time. In the psychology literature, they might refer to this as ecological rationality. Whereas we all as human beings, we all use heuristics all the time to make decisions. We don't behave fully rationally very often, as you all are aware. So what heuristics do these organizations actually use? And do they use a variety of heuristics with a toolbox sort of way? Or do they rely on 1 or 2 basic heuristics to make decisions all the time, in which case they might be less flexible, right? So those are the 3 key propositions. And we argue in the paper that we think they probably all are mutually supportive. And in fact, all 3 need to be present. There only be conditions that are in existence are mutually supportive. In other words, we just have more information, but we don't have any we're relying on the same evaluative criteria that we've always used And we used the same heuristic selection sort of rule as we've always used. More information might be bad, right? It might cripple or give us analysis paralysis. So we say. Okay, so methods here very quickly. We use the institutional grammar tool to code institutional statements pertaining to water utilities. We have a couple papers out that talk about how we selected these cases in the US, so I won't spend much time on that. But essentially, this is about 1,200 or so institutional statements in the case of Indianapolis and about 300 or so for Phoenix. And then we use this sort of new technique called institutional network diagrams, where we take the syntactic structure of these statements and we determine essentially when we might have an attribute and another object, right, which could be another body, it could be another individual, it could be some inanimate object, but when there's some kind of conditional dependency, right? So in other words, the actor can't take the action until someone else takes an action as well, right? So we have this kind of dependency that might exist formally. We're also looking though for something called institutional voids, where there's not a lot of clear guidance as to how decisions are supposed to be made. And in climate governance, this is usually the case, right? We don't see a whole lot of formal climate governance worked into how organizations, governments tend to make decisions. So we initially thought that was probably bad. Now we're thinking maybe it's actually a positive thing that we don't have some of that formal guidance. And then once we've created these sort of network diagram, we simply use it to do process tracing, which is we see how a case has played out over a multi-year period where they've gone through several rounds of rate making. And so this is something that we in the CIS framework is called the controller. And it's simply a system of rules that are designed to try and detect errors. So if we think that, we want to provide robust water service for the next 50 years, we think that we're currently doing so in a sustainable fashion, but now we discover that through signal error that our forecasts are off and we need to make changes. We need to make additional investments to sort of account for a drought, right? Or account for, changes in water quality or something like that. That's the error signal. And so there's a process that plays out in these institutions to try and in these situations to try and adjust to that error. And so we have kind of 3 steps in this process that plays out: searching, where we're collecting sensory input and information; updating, where we're now trying to update our priors essentially to decide if we need to make changes or not; and then the last step is the actual selecting. That's the decision to change or maintain effort, again using heuristics. So the bottom table there is sort of how the process tracing plays out, and we actually explicitly look at attributes and aims from our statements. That's how we get started doing the process tracing. And then the kind of things we're looking for: the empirical fingerprints, the evidence type, and then the theoretical certainty and uniqueness are essentially how unique or how hard it is to find evidence of this particular action playing out. Okay. So this is what it looks like, and this is a very busy slide, but this is what the institutional diagram looks like for Phoenix. And this is just for the Phoenix rate making and investment process that plays out, right? So Arizona, of course, is a prior appropriation doctrine state. And in Phoenix, one of our cases, they have the Water Services Department, which draws water from the Salt and Berry River watersheds. They also rely on Colorado River water, which is becoming increasingly non-existent. So they've been in a state of drought here for about 20 years or so. And what we can point to in the institutional diagram are the role of 3 different sort of attributes, right? The director of the water department at the top there. Then a Citizens Water Rate Advisory Committee, which is created. It is appointed by the mayor and city council. And then that Citizens Advisory Board is supposed to annually review and recommend rates, but at the same time, the director is tasked statutorily with controlling and ensuring water supply sufficiency and also making recommendations. So this is kind of the main dependency that we focus. You've got these 2 different kind of actors here that are involved in trying to make this determination. And then we could just kind of lay that out in the table. A little additional context. I can skip over this. We all know Phoenix is in trouble, right? We all know. Okay, so let's just look at what we found out after doing process tracing. So there were between 2015 and 2021, there've been multiple rate increases that the utility has had to engage in based on continued kind of updated predictions about the system and future supply condition. Like I meant, they're in a historic drought now. And so they have to keep sort of coming back to the council and initiating this process that plays out. It usually takes about a year because that citizens advisory board meets, it's citizens, as it's described, they meet over a period of months and months to try and evaluate whether or not to raise rates or not. And what we found out was the information over this period of this playing out several times is that they did tend to rely on more diverse information. And say more than what? Well, more than the other case that I'm going to show you, right? So that's one of the initial problems with some of this literature. If it's based on one case, how do we tell if it's more or less adaptive, but more or less than what, right? So, so here we find they use more diverse information. They particularly relied on a lot of historical modeling from like tree rings and stuff. They go back like 900 years. They're pulling in a lot of scientific evidence from other federal and state agencies as well to try to inform their expectations or predictions about what's going to happen. Separately, the Citizens Water Rate Advisory Committee spent a year doing its own kind of equity evaluation or its own analysis where it compared itself to other peer cities to try to determine if these rate increases were equitable or not, right? And so we found as a result of that, and partly that process, that there was more diverse participation. The argument tended to, that the department would make over the time tended to shift more to highlight scientific uncertainty, the need to try and be prepared and look at different scenarios. So they're engaging in a lot more analysis than they were initially in the earlier part of the decade. And then lastly, this is the hardest part, is trying to figure out what heuristics people use when they make decisions. Usually this is done in an experimental setting. And so when we're looking at cases and we're looking at public hearings and transcripts of meetings and stuff like that, it's a little bit more difficult. But what we are fairly confident we're able to say is that there's a class of decision-making heuristics that are called equity heuristics, meaning say we have 5 or 6 different sort of cues we're looking for, we're going to treat them all equally and we're going to add them all up, basically, right? That might be one way we do it. So we're not relying on just one type of cue to make a decision. We're relying on multiple cues. All right, I'm at my time already. That was fast. So switching to the second case here, we see a very different institutional design in Indianapolis. Of course, it's a different water law doctrine because we're east of the Mississippi. But the system within the state is set up much differently. So the utility is regulated by the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission, meaning the city itself or the utility itself can't make rate hike decisions alone. The utility had historically been privately owned. Indianapolis purchased this in 2002 and handed it over to a private contractor. The contractor then issued lots and lots of debt and didn't really take much care of the system. They had a moratorium on rate increases for about a decade. So there's a lot of underinvestment. By 2011, they realized they needed to change this up. So they handed this over to the Citizens Energy Group, which now runs the water utility. It's a private, a public trust. That's the Citizens Board at the top. The board of directors is appointed by the Citizens Board of Trustees. These are all private sort of individuals who volunteer to be on these boards, and the political actors here don't make any of these appointments. Right? So this is totally handled by sort of this trust. But separately, we see 2 other actors that tend to be important: the state regulatory body, the commission, and then the Office of Utility Consumer Counselor, which is kind of the watchdog, the state watchdog office that tries to intervene when rate hike requests are made, and they typically do and try to fight. So Indianapolis doesn't have as significant a drought condition, even though we were in a drought this last summer and the summer before, and we had a major drought in 2012, which people don't usually realize. That ended up drawing down one of the 2 reservoirs almost to dead pool. So we ended up in a very perilous situation in 2012. So there are droughts here, but primarily Indianapolis is concerned with water quality. We're in an EPA consent decree back since 2006. To deal with the combined sewer overflows from flood events, and the climate impacts that we're looking at are going to be increased precipitation and flooding. So water quality is going to continue to be a major challenge here. So what do we find? Well, less diverse information, right? This is the less or more. They tend to rely on historic precipitation patterns and then expected demographic shifts in the future, which are, if you spend any time looking at long-range planning, those are always wrong, right? Those predictions never pan out. And then the information that tends to be utilized in this rate-making process is cost of service, right? Financial cost of service stuff. Less participation. They're very privileged actors that are involved in this rate-making process that played out over a couple cycles here. I skipped over this, but citizens asked for a 22% rate increase in 2015. They got shot down. They ended up getting a 16% increase instead after about a year of negotiation. They then came back last year and asked for a $3 user charge, got shot down again, and instead gave an 87-cent user charge. So typically in those processes, the watchdog intervenes, other institutional water users intervene, and they end up knocking down what the initial rate request was. And they tend to rely on this word that shows up in the institutional grammar a lot, reasonable. So the rate increase needs to be reasonable. And the way they define reasonable is usually, what did we give you last time? So if we let you have this rate last time, that's how we're going to determine if you can have the rate increase this time. So it's this purely sort of path dependent kind of evaluative criteria. All right, so we have a lot of questions left. The first thing though is to sort of just this recognition that we don't think rigidity here is necessarily always maladaptive. It can be useful when it creates sort of guardrails or scaffolding for humans to interact. We have this basic problem, which is how to characterize whether institutional design is adaptive or not. We simply don't know that. We can see the evidence of more or less, sort of information, more or less participation, et cetera, but we don't know yet if that's adaptive or maladaptive. Usually, we need natural selection to kill off some maladaptive traits to make that conclusion. But do we need to wait though to make this sort of determination until we see this kind of natural or SES phenomenon play out? How do we kind of bypass that? That's kind of a key issue. To that point, when does rigidity versus flexibility help? How do they interact with each other? We see that interaction in the Phoenix case. We see kind of a negative interaction between these two in the Indianapolis case. So what does it mean, right? And again, as I mentioned before, where are the thresholds for our propositions? What are we missing? What propositions might we want to include? Which ones need to be refined? And then what are the trade-offs here? So we have a number of things going on. We've got, like I said, eight actual cases where we've coded the institutional grammar data. We're going to be working on trying to apply the IGT to interview data as well. The institutional grammar initiative that's out at Syracuse University has just created a working group to try to figure out how to deal with interview data or other kinds of not formal but informal institutional information that we could try to code. But then we also have the dynamical systems team and the ABM folks who are some of which are on this Zoom, but that's where we're ultimately going to be able to sort of determine the trade-offs that are involved in how we set the system up. All right, that's all I got. Thank you. Sorry I went over.
Okay. Well, the queue is open. Bernie has the first question, and then we'll let everybody think. And I'm sure I have several.
Aaron, I think you said you're studying 8 different municipalities. You're studying these 2. Are there others you're looking at beside Phoenix and Indianapolis?
Yeah, so in our, I'll jump right here. In our initial stage of the project, we took 50 cities. We winnowed them down through some different multidimensional scaling techniques and stuff to about 16. Of those 16, we've now coded the institutional statements in 8 of them. So yeah, and these are the 8 that are coded. We developed, and this is in a PSJ paper that came out last year that we did. We developed this kind of taxonomy of this soft public infrastructure. So different systems, and we use the rule topology to create this.
I asked that is because you're presenting the 2 here, Phoenix and Indianapolis, and I like one's Western water law and one's Eastern water law, but they're both very Republican cities that tend to spend less. Mm-hmm. And so you'd want to look at cities that might have an attitude of spending more as a comparison. If you've got them, so I just wasn't clear of that.
Yeah, and that was kind of like one of our own trade-offs we had to immediately do, because most of the team is in Phoenix, so they're just obsessed with Phoenix, and that's no offense, Adam. Sorry, I was just kidding. And,
Phoenix is for the West with the water issues, it's a great situation. It's just Indianapolis particularly. I mean, I know it's a Democratic city, but it's in a very Republican state, and so the damper on spending more money or having more laws or whatever is clearly there.
Yeah, and that's, and also, Phoenix is in this historic drought, and Indy is, so there are a lot of, these are definitely like most different cases, and they're most different in terms of the institutional design too, which is, we have Indy over there, which is what we call it's a T5, which is low accountability rate makers, where they essentially have a lot more autonomy and less accountability. And then Arizona or Phoenix is over here in the direct political oversight, because the actual city council and mayor make the rate decisions. So they're very different in that respect. So our next goal is to compare like cases to each other.
Okay, good.
I'll ask a question or two while other folks are thinking. So there was a lot in this paper, and I.
Sorry.
No, it's great. I mean, a lot of it's because you're bringing together so many different literatures, right? You've got sort of some complex system stuff, some resilience theory, institutional grammar, SES, like there's a lot that you're bringing together, which is a really impressive feat. And so some of this, so one or two of my questions are sort of about distillation of all of that. And so questions like, some of these dimensions seem like they could be reduced to something like veto player theory, which is a very oversimplified way of thinking about some of the things that you're talking about. But I sort of wonder about, for veto players, information matters, but at the end of the day, right, what matters is how many people doesn't know for whom saying no like ends the game, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'd be curious, is that replaced by something here, or is that an additional dimension that you feel like you would need to include? I would think not, given how much you have. And so that's one literature that I'd be curious about. Another is this, you've got diversity in here in a bunch of different areas, right? You've got it in information, and then you've got it in participation, which I was a little curious about because I didn't quite internalize that from the paper, what you meant by that, but it did make me think of the sort of Hong and Page stuff about diversity ability trade-off, and the extent to which, is when solving hard problems, right? We think about, is it the case that diverse teams are better than highly capable teams, right? And the Hong Page stuff says diversity is better, right? And that's because they draw on diverse information, because they have multiple mental models, because they're right. And so I'm curious, you've sort of pulled apart lots of different dimensions of lots of different literature. And I want to sort of ask you to speak about sort of why that's important to do, and whether those things should or could be reduced. Mm-hmm. Some of these literature dimensions that I've very haphazardly thrown at you.
Yeah, so I think the veto question is like an empirical question. And I think after we start building a few more of these institutional network diagrams, we're going to be able to maybe address that. Particularly if we start to see veto players show up. We actually thought that in the Phoenix case, or I thought anyway, that we might see something like that, because we have, both of the rate making decisions have to flow through the city manager's office, and the city manager then passes this along to the council. And so we thought that actually might be a place, and we actually note it there with the dot, right? The dot line starts when it goes through the city manager. So we thought that was going to be the key dependency. And in this case, it didn't matter at all. The city manager just passes along the rate increase to the council, right? Now, there's obviously the manager's office is involved, right? They're not going to be a completely factor in raising billions of dollars in infrastructure investment, but it ended up not being a place where that happened, right? That there was a lot more frankly informal, I think, potential for veto players. Like there were a few folks on this. I mean, the mayor and the council appoint the citizens advisory committee here. A couple of the appointees are former city council members, so they have potential axe to grind. They have the potential to try to slow down a process or something. So I think maybe we haven't explicitly worked in that literature as well, because of, like you said, there's so much stuff we're pulling from. But it would be useful, maybe when we get to the point of more formally analyzing all of the institutional positions, right, that everyone plays, and paying more attention to that. Here we were really looking at this as a process that was going to play out, and trying to detect which places it started getting stuck more, right, if it did. Pertaining to the, maybe related to that, where our propositions come from, we're bouncing all over the place. This is directly from Lynn's argumentation that we need to relax these assumptions of rational choice when we're dealing with social dilemmas. And so we literally took the three areas where the three assumptions of rational choice that you need to relax, perfect information in a situation, a clear sort of normative valuation of what's better and what's worse amongst your options, and then a clear selection strategy, right? And we sort of relaxed all three of those and said, well, particularly when you're dealing with climate and really no one is that confident about what's going to happen, 50 years from now, how do you deal with this from a manager's perspective, right? How do you deal with this administratively? How much should you try to go out and find additional information and bring that into decision-making venues? How, in terms of the normative valuations, I tend to agree that more diverse organizations tend to perform better. And this is pulling from my traditional public administration background. We see more representativeness in decisions. They tend to make better decisions, particularly more equitable decisions over time. In the case of Indianapolis, I mean, the citizens in their rate filings tried to get a rate making structure that would provide a low income discount for lower income households, and the commission rejected that and said that wasn't fair to the other institutional like water buyers, right? And it wasn't fair to other current users who would have to subsidize like this particular rate. So and that was the case also where there were not really clear advocates in that process for low income water users. So again, an N of one there, but I tend to think empirically, the literature suggests that more diversity generally is going to help because you're bringing in people that have essentially different valuations, normative valuations, and they're going to be able to bring in their own different experiences or expertise and help you kind of triangulate, right? And that's what seemed to happen in the Phoenix case. But again, the trade-off here that we think is sort of the transaction costs and the difficulty that you're going to have the larger the group becomes trying to sort of coalesce around a new kind of valuation or new norm. I think maybe I'd answer in that.
Yeah, you got. Yeah. Yes, that was great. Thank you. Okay, I think Elijah Tangenberg is next, and then I have Gustavo.
Oh no, somebody.
Yeah, somebody.
Okay.
It's Elijah's coming in on Zoom.
Hi.
Yes?
Yeah, sorry, my internet connection has been really weird right now for some reason. Yeah, so I'm actually work at the city of Phoenix, so this is all very fun information to see. I really appreciate you guys going through the time and effort to do this research. I was wondering where we can expect to find this published, or what exactly is the deadline?
Oh boy, that's the kiss of death. So this is the current paper. There's a special issue of Ecology and Society that actually the workshop has been promoting, right? That's our current kind of target publication destination. Now we have another paper that's been under review for a year that also looks at Phoenix. Actually, if you're interested in more of this research pertaining to Phoenix, there are a couple papers in the pipeline that are going to be coming out, we hope, in the next few months. But again, it's kind of, I don't know who else is on the call. I'm right, not serious much, but very soon, very soon.
Okay, and those would be going through Ecology and Society, right?
That's one of them. Another is has an R&R, and I probably shouldn't.
Oh, okay. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah. Yeah. I also
Okay.
don't want to blow up the peer review process if we have one of the reviewers is on this call. So yep.
Okay, I'll just keep my eyes and ears open then.
Thank you.
All right, I think Gustavo is next.
Okay, so I was thinking about this just to consider the problem just bare bones. Essentially, what we have is here is a regulation of public utilities, so it's natural monopoly. But the users have asymmetric information about the cost, okay? So, and then you may have different ways of solving that issue. That would be a starting point. So my way of approaching this could be as maybe a little bit plain vanilla. It could be, well, now you have climate change. How this affect the asymmetric information public regulation problem? My initial hypothesis would be, well, this is increasing the asymmetric information problem because it's like now there is more volatility about whatever the weather, climate, whatever, that essentially give well the producers know more than the consumers, so that rises the level of asymmetric information. By definition, what happened in every solution, even the best one, more rents for the producers. No, so I was trying to think. It's like if you think in that way, again, where this way of thinking would fit with your hypothesis. Is it not the correct way of thinking all this, what I'm missing, so on and so forth. So
yeah, I mean, I think that the fundamental problem is uncertainty, right? And I think these systems, since they're designed to be robust, they're designed to calculate risk and sort of make decisions to minimize risk. And when we're dealing with uncertainty and not risk, it's very difficult to sort of use the same, decision calculus. So that's part of the problem here. And I think, so I'm I work on a couple of, as an advisor on another project, water project that is related to this, that is primarily engineering folks, right? And when they go out and work with these utilities, what they hear is that, look, we know climate's happening, but we just can't deal with it. Like, give us some real data that lets us make a decision, and then we'll factor that into, our planning. But without having that concrete information, we're going to ignore it, And so they deal with that information asymmetry that way, right? Which I think we're making a proposition here that that's not the best, probably not the most appropriate way to sort of try to account for that uncertainty. And I think the way one of the things Phoenix does, for example, in its water resources plan is that they map out several scenarios. What's going to happen when under this scenario, what happens under this scenario. And then they try to then, in that sense, process that information or use what information they do have to try to improve their decision making. I'm not. Yeah, is that?
Can I have a follow up on this? Let me be more politically incorrect. So if you want essentially to deal with climate issues, essentially you are expecting on average more scarcity of the resource. And then you want people to, use this resource in a more, reasonable way. So the best way of doing it, like, give more power to the producer, which is not very nice. It's like just remove the voice of the people, whatever, because what they would be pushing is for lower prices, expanding the quantity, more investment. So essentially, that's what they will be pushing. So it's like the politically incorrect hypothesis here will be, okay, more power to the producers. They will keep more rents. I totally understand that that's bad. That's good for climate. So the consumers will be seeing higher prices and they will start rationing more this scarce resource that is becoming really scarce because of climate change.
And, I think that came out in our interviewing because we had, on the one hand, the Indianapolis utility managers who said, hey, we don't care about the politics, right? We're not appointed by partisan actors. We don't have, we can just do what we want to do, basically, was the implication, right? And on the flip side, some of the Phoenix folks were, I really wish we could be in that situation, right? But we answer to, these political actors, and they are very much in tune with, the problems of the day and that sort of public perception and issue salience and all that. And in reality, though, neither one of those systems, at least over the last 10 years, has functioned the way we thought they were going to when it played out. The Indianapolis case, yeah, they had a lot of, they don't have to answer to partisan politicians, but they can't get a rate hike through the state utility commission, right? And that commission in this case, because it would relied on this very formal, path-dependent, selection criteria, was able to knock down both their full rate request and their request to have a more equitable rate structure, right? They shot both those things down. And so they don't actually have, when you look at the full process that has to play out, they don't have more discretion. And so, I mean, that's just like what happened in these cases. So, I think that we walked into this with the expectation that we would see something like that, and it didn't really play out that way.
Another way of reading the same thing would be that the traditional representative in these state boards, they're even tougher with respect to prices than, participation, like grassroots participation.
Mhm.
They are much difficult to convince because the level of asymmetry of information with them is not as high as with regular citizens.
And one of the primary sort of objectors as well, or interveners, were these other cities, right? The other cities that get their water from the central utility. These are institutional water users. They objected to basically everything. They objected to even like the Indianapolis, the utility did a fantastic job after the 2012 drought of building a brand new reservoir and building it for basically 30 million instead of 300 million. And the other cities objected to them including that as the cost of that into their overall cost of infrastructure costs, right? They got this great deal, and you still saw these other institutional actors, most of them in suburbs where the population is rapidly growing, right? And they don't want to have their water costs increase. And so they were the ones, they're the privileged sort of institutional actors here that were able to really help shoot down the higher rate request. I think that gets to the issue there, right? So they're not an advocacy. There were no advocacy groups at all that were even mentioned or that even referenced at all in the entire year-long rate process.
I think Shannon was next.
Yeah. This is so cool to see this developing, Aaron. The last couple of years. Also, I'm obsessed with your co-author, so it's awesome to have them in the room. So thinking about that first piece, the idea of that too much information. When you guys think of it, are you thinking of it just like a bell?
So we're not sure yet. So that's one of the actually the next steps that our models team is working on, is to try to actually, because the dynamical systems model we have right now has a couple of has basically some institutional parameters in the model, and we call it institutional friction, and we model that and see how long it takes for a utility to respond to that signal error. And we're able to then, with that model, kind of look out over 100 years and see where the model overreacts, where it underreacts, and then where you end up kind of exhausting the resource, right, at the end of the run. And what we're going to try to, that's a very simple model. And what we're trying to do is kind of unpack what institutional friction actually is. And we model it as short-term investment, long-term investment, rate making, right? That's essentially those three factors. But in the future, we're going to try to figure out where the information content or the size of information, right? We'll figure out how to do this, where we might find a similar scenario, right? That plays out modeling wise. In other words, how much information is too much information and they delay reacting, right? They don't react quickly enough.
When we talk about these, what's the general makeup as far as like experts, long-term bureaucrats, just as I assume, and then so that's question one. And then question two would be, do they all have access to the same amounts of information?
So a lot of the information from our cases is really reflected in the reports that they produce, right? And so, for example, Phoenix has every 10 years or so a new water resources plan. It's the last one was in 2021. The previous one, which was 2011, I think, much different in terms of the information that they built into that 2021 plan. It's a very exhaustive, data-rich plan. So we look at that and treat that as empirical fingerprint of the data they're pulling, because they also disclose, like we're getting data from Bureau of Reclamation, from state agencies, and those scientific advisors from all those groups are participating. Of course, right now, it's an ant farm or ant hill in Phoenix and these other, Colorado River Basin communities, because they're in crisis mode. So there is a lot more that's induced a lot more collaboration, I think, a lot more information sharing. And but the general, so for example, we found the Phoenix case, the information, a lot of that was very accessible. Those citizens meetings happen over the course of a year. They went out and, hired another academic to develop a affordability ratio kind of metric, comparing themselves to other cities. They had lots of public testimony. I mean, we might consider those symbolic sort of forms of access, but compared to Indianapolis, it was incredibly wide open and available. I mean, we have to public records request Indianapolis just to get their water resources plan, right? They don't just cough it up. So they're much more restrictive in terms of information availability. And once you get under the hood, you're like, wow, they got like 2 data sources here that they use for everything, and one of them's probably not accurate. I feel like I'm bagging on Indianapolis. It's very, very, very interesting. Very interesting case.
Do you wanna? Okay, would it be, I know you're next, but would it be, I know
I don't have
Development
anything.
has to leave in just a couple of
all good.
minutes. Is that okay? Kurt, do you want to ask you said you had a quick question?
Yeah, Aaron, I really like the framing, the cognitive science framing here and the focus on biases and heuristics. I was just wondering if, you mentioned the drought in 2012. There's been a lot of, there's been, I think, something like 300-year storms in the last 5 years. Do you see evidence of availability bias and sticky reference points and people sort of developing heuristics out of those specific events?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And we have to kind of hedge at this point in the analysis because we really developed the focus here or the framing in an abductive fashion, meaning we started off kind of deductively based on the prior literature and the Urban Water and Ostrom's work. And then once we started getting into the cases, we started realizing, we need to be paying more attention to some of these things like the heuristics. And so we don't have an identification strategy right now for very specific heuristics that maybe specific actors or groups use. That's why I kind of hedge it and say we've got these 2 classes of heuristics, right? We see like across the groups through a process in Phoenix, there were multiple kinds of cues that they would utilize, right? Like, for example, a comparison, like we're better than our neighbor, right? On this one metric. So this is good, right? In Indianapolis, it was really a class of 1 reason heuristics, which is where we can see what, the entire determination of what to do is based on what you did last time and what rate increase you were allowed to have last time. So that's a class of heuristics, like 1 reason where there's 1 dominant kind of cue you rely on. But we really need to unpack that, and we want to unpack that, in probably the next stage of going back and doing more interviews, right? Because again, most of the lit that does get at heuristics, right? It's experimental, and so they try to experimentally manipulate specific heuristics. We think we can get there eventually, but we're going to try to inform that with more careful observation and interviewing.
Cool, thanks. I'm really interested in that, and I'll probably come talk to you at some point about it.
Absolutely, yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
Okay, great. I think you're next.
Very quickly, thank you very much. This is both important and interesting. I think the things, one, just a point of curiosity. You mentioned it somewhere, and I may not have tried to scroll the notes. Institutional voids, I think you said, and you passed over it saying it may be something like it may be a problem or not. Now, I think voids makes me think of deficits. I think of democracy deficits. I think some of that literatures and such. But I'm more interested there about is a problem or not framing. Just what was behind that. I'm just curious. The only other thing I'm really interested in is your own personal hopes for the research. I mean, you've named some of the elements of it, of course, and part of this, the learning framing is interesting to me. Institutional learning is always interesting, of course. So if you say a little more about your hopes for the research, once complete, and once you have, I'm always interested in that.
Yeah. No, great, thanks. So last question first. My immediate hopes are another 5-year NSF grants.
Let's move on. Let's move on to the other.
So we've had a couple of stakeholder meetings where we kind of meet back with the utility folks and sort of show them the model and like, what is this useful? What are we missing? Whatever. And those are pretty fun and cool. And we hope to be able to do a lot more of that once we're more confident in our model and our model's predictive power, right? And so the next step is going to be automating some of these coding processes, which is work is happening on multiple dimensions to do that. So we won't have to spend, in my case, 3 years hand coding, 15,000 or 20,000 statements or whatever we ended up pulling from all kinds of documents. That is the goal here is to try to help utilities, the normative goal, the practical goal is to try to help utilities understand, recognize that robustness vulnerability trade-off. Because the more you design the systems to be robust, this literature shows, to high frequency disturbances, the more you become vulnerable to these low frequency ones, right? The big things, when you have a 100-year storm and a 500-year storm in 5 years, right? Now you're not prepared for that. Your infrastructure is not built for that. So the more we continue to harden the infrastructure like that, it's a policy direction that I think is going to be more and more problematic in the coming years and decades. We see that reflected in all of the federal climate legislation as well, to try to emphasize green instead of gray infrastructure and stuff like that. So there's just this paradigm of thinking that needs to shift, right, in terms of how to engineer these systems. Pertaining to institutional voids, this is actually a concept that has come out in like the management and kind of business literature, thinking about newly emergent markets where there aren't clear property rights for how institutional actors behave. And so people can behave opportunistically, in these places where there's not clear, clear-cut established, property rights. So institutional voids in that literature is a negative thing. It's like there's not enough clarity of or guidance for how exchanges are supposed to occur, right? We initially thought that institutional voids would be bad in this context too, because they don't provide clear direction that you have to deal with, climate change and the increased uncertainty in that. And that's in the planning literature. Whenever you do code like comprehensive plans or strategic plans or whatever, and you're dealing with climate, you get dinged for not addressing uncertainty, right? In that literature. I'm jumping to different literatures here really quickly, but generally, like planners have this orientation where they think you have to deal with uncertainty. If you ignore it and don't incorporate it, you're turning a blind eye to it. And what we sort of found out in the voids that we've identified so far is that gives the actors actually more latitude to deal with this. Like in Phoenix, I watched we watched a year or two of the public hearings, and transcribed these and coded all these. And the water services director, not one time, any of those public meetings said climate change. Didn't come up one time, but she repeatedly said uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen. The scientists are telling us, never seen anything like this before, right? So she was able to navigate that without using the partisan charged word of climate. And so that's why I ended up sort of altering my expectation about how voids would function, right? They can provide, the potential for dealing with or dodging or avoiding or diffusing that kind of partisan sort of charge. But they could also go the other way too, right? We might find the examples where they don't provide, there isn't enough scaffolding there for responding to climate.
All right, we're gonna do a lightning round.
Awesome.
You're gonna ask one, and then Bernie, and then Shannon, your follow-up, and then I'll talk to Aaron after. Sure. Okay. Bernie, and then you will get the last word to respond and any final words.
Okay.
Okay, so the two of them will ask.
All right. Yeah.
All right, great, awesome.
Quick question. Thank you very much, Aaron. Very interesting. Enjoyed reading it and very useful. I wonder to what extent the cases, the climate change, the cities are a factor in your model, or to rephrase it differently, do you suspect you can infer from these cases to other areas in public administration, other wicked problems, not water, not climate change, not environmental at all? Can you give us a wider look on that perspective?
Bernie?
I was thinking of the outreach, and you're talking about planners, and you talk about engineers. And they're in never, never land far apart. And so how do you, thinking ahead, how are you going to work with those two very diverse groups that don't even want to be in the same room?
Good question.
I think that's not, actually, there's only two. There's only two. So go ahead.
Okay, cool. So,
And then final words.
so great question. You know, most of my day job when I'm not doing this water stuff is focusing on local government, sustainability and climate action. So I think in terms of how organizations build capacity and then try to institutionalize these capacities or competencies, as I like to call them, I think there probably is some overlap, right? I mean, local governments, communities do a lot more than water. That's one, obviously, of their urban services that are provided. It's a specific type of good. So there's not going to be a lot that is, you know, exactly transferable, but in terms of how managers deal with uncertainty and policymakers deal with uncertainty, I think some of that is translatable, and I do see in my other work, right? Trying to find that sweet spot between how much information do we need to be able to make the best decisions at a given point. So that I think does kind of translate. To the question of planners and engineers, I'm going to hope that we can find managers and policymakers in between those folks who might try to, you know, bring them together, so to speak. I think that planners, I'm around a lot of planners. Generally, they don't view this as something that they feel like they're ignoring, right? I think that they're generally trying to figure out how do we account for this. So they are aware of that issue. The engineers, maybe if we are able to, you know, give them, okay, look, this is what after we've developed, you know, model, you know, 4.0, and we're fairly confident we can take it on a roadshow, you know, maybe that can speak their language a little bit better, because again, you know, the whole concept of the CIS framework and robust control came out of electrical engineering. So, you know, that is something that I think they can understand and relate to a bit. So, I mean, you know, it's a different kind of collective action dilemma, right?
Any final questions, thoughts, comments, reflections?
No, it's thank you all very much for attending and asking these great questions. I hope that the project got delayed a little bit because of COVID and not being able to get out and as much of the field work as we wanted to initially, but we're getting really close. So hopefully by this time next year or so, we'll have some really cool stuff to demonstrate.